Assalamualaikum everyone. Hey Yassir, how you doing? Good morning or afternoon, I guess it is. Beautiful day here in Melbourne. Now, this Jummah, we had at my local masjid, we had people wearing Muslim Vote Matters t-shirts. And we've seen them around online, there's a website on Initiative Samarkand if you're there, and other places as well. And the story goes like this, right? From what I've heard at least. And the story goes like this. Gaza happened, October 7th happened, and we saw that there was this huge vacuum where no one was representing the voice of Muslims or standing up to genocide in the way that we wanted. And people come to realize that we need real representation in Parliament, and hence the Muslim Vote Matters or the Muslim Vote initiative was born, both in Melbourne and Sydney. Now, the rationale goes is that if we collectively vote in a particular direction across a range of seats that could potentially be swung in another direction, we could potentially secure or get the balance of power in Parliament. And given there's a history of sort of minority governments, there's a possibility that in the Australian Parliament we could have a hung Parliament where no one really dominates, but it's through a bunch of casting votes of independents and whatnot, or minorities, that can really push certain policy decisions in a particular way. Now, that's a story, and it's coming up to election time. We'll probably get an election called within the next month or so, and we're getting leaflets and some activism happening on that end. Now, it's really, I know for someone like myself and a lot of people in my community, people are thinking about it and asking a lot of questions. And it seems that there's not enough answers around these questions. And we've had conversations around this. But one of the big things that they're trying to do is, and I've heard, is that they're trying to educate the community. And that we need to educate the community because Muslims either don't vote or don't vote enough or don't vote in the right direction or don't understand how the system operates. And because they don't understand how the system operates, they can't leverage it in the direction that is most beneficial for the community. So that sort of sets the context around Muslim Vote Matters. Did you have any thoughts around?
Bismillah, I should start by kind of acknowledging that I am a critic of the current presentation of MVM's arguments. And I'm a critic not because of just ideological, quote unquote, reasons. It's because I remain to this day quite confused by their messaging and what they're saying. Even with your summary, firstly, a hung parliament is a very rare event. Minority governments too, really. But also the claim that this is an education about Muslims who don't vote or don't vote enough or don't vote in the correct direction. I don't see much of any of this public pedagogy. I don't see it. I see pep talks and aspirations, but I'm yet to see that education that you're speaking about. It hasn't been received by me yet. I haven't been able to access it, despite being a keen observer, speaking to many of them, albeit in the background, and sometimes critiquing them online. I don't see that education, so I'm confused. In fact, I'll go a step further. I don't think they are educating Muslims. I think they're miseducating us. There's an overinvestment in a system that is designed to racially exclude. And this week alone, we've seen Israel participate in a heightened form of its ongoing genocide, where I think, depending on where you get your news from, 200 children killed in a day, and to the shame of mainstream silence about it. So the idea that the system is somehow designed to accommodate racialized minorities, Muslims in this case, or Arabs or others, or pro-Palestinians, to be able to redirect it in a direction that is of our interest is in of itself a miseducation for me. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think the system is so stacked that it doesn't have ability to move or sway in particular directions, but I don't think MVM has spoken enough to real material, ideological, psychological, economic barriers built into the system that can be overcome through voting. I haven't heard them speak about it. I hear them appropriate a language about, yes, the system is, it is what it is. Yes, the system is corrupt, but then they go on and behave like it's not. So I do think they ignore the deeper architecture of state power. I do think they ignore, and that's why they're focused on party politics. I can't tell the difference when they speak between government, parties, and state. They collapse a few. And I do think they present voting as a primary means of reshaping Australian geopolitical postures and alliances, civilizational alliances, particularly regarding Palestine. And they can say what they want, but it's born out of this kind of community frustration, hurt, anger in regards to Palestine. And they place an exaggerated faith in the electoral system. And to the point, I mean, I might go later, there's some victim blaming here to Muslims, that somehow we are where we are because we haven't done the right type of voting. And then there's an assumption here, and this is where the miseducation is for me, that it can be reclaimed the state can be reclaimed to service global South justice. But the country we're in, a liberal democracy, is in a settler-colonial state like Australia, is not a neutral tool. It's not waiting to be used differently. Its structure is built to sustain a particular order and a racial hierarchy, and they haven't addressed it. So you don't have to agree with this politics. You don't have to say, oh, that's just, they haven't addressed it. This is a particular view of the way the Australian state operates, and they haven't bothered to counter that view, dismantle that view, and therefore interpret why voting would be a counter to this view. They just say we're educating. And so in education is a contest. You don't have to have a particular, you can belong to a political school, whether it's a view of Australia's colonial, whether it's a view of Australia's liberal, but there has to be a contest. There has to be a dispute and debate. So education isn't believe what I say, think the way I think. It is, because this is what social sciences are when we try to navigate and make sense of the phenomena that is the social. There has to be contests. And I don't see any of that education. And so by encouraging Muslims to over-identify with democratic participation, I will claim MVM miseducates the community about the nature of power. It creates the illusion of proximity to influence, and this has happened throughout the community's history. This illusion that if we're close to the spheres of influence, we can somehow shape the system. And what happens, these myths conceal the actual sources of violence and how these violences are embedded into the system. So that pedagogy or that claim that they're educating doesn't equip us to confront the reality of the world, the state, our condition. It actually prepares us to be disappointed by it again and again. And secondly, I'll just ask you, who are they to educate? Like, I don't mean to be arrogant or hubris there. Like, I feel like there's I feel like it's a particular caste, like who rely on their self-efficacy. And what I mean by that, they've done well in maybe their professional caste, right? So they're lawyers, they're maybe doctors, and they've done well, and then they've transferred that. Well, I've been rewarded by studying hard and working hard in the system. Therefore, the system is capable of responding to the effort I put into it. Well, no. The system wants doctors, it wants lawyers, it wants engineers. It doesn't want a politically self-determined global South represented through its channels of power to reorganize or redirect the state to interests that are not of its own. And so that we're going to educate. Well, I don't know who they are. Who are they? Like, I teach politics. I have a PhD in politics, and I can't see their education. I can't see it. I don't know where they're getting it from. I don't know where their sources are. And to be honest, I promise you, it's just standard liberal democratic mythologies. Now, if your argument, sorry for over speaking, is they're going to tell us how to vote, like they're teaching Muslims how to vote, then they'll have to tell me that Muslims haven't been doing that, right? Then they'll have to tell me that there hasn't been, like Muslims are illiterate when it comes to how to vote. I'm not sure about that. I mean, we have to be convinced.
I want to touch on that point, right? Because that is a claim that Muslims are illiterate when it comes to voting. That I mean, at the end of the day, whether you're pro, anti-voting, or whatever side of the fence you sit, people are going to vote, and they're going to vote in a particular direction. or they're going to cast donkey votes, or they're not going to use their vote. And so there's a psychology around what voting entails, but also the value that it has. But then also, I wanted to ask you specifically around this idea of how democracy is supposed to operate and how it actually operates.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's two parts to that. Like the first one is absolutely. I picked up on that, and I've seen it in their pamphlets and some of the social online media performances and how they deal with critics. I'm gonna be quite blunt about it. There's a lot of victim blaming here, disguised as empowerment and mobilization, which is simply they're just recycling motivational tropes that are ultimately obscure structural barriers and repackage exclusion as some type of personal community failure. That for me is really hurtful, right? Like we have done a lot as a community. We've done a lot, but they always presented it like we're somehow just listen to the way they speak. Muslims need to wake up. We must do more, and we're taken for granted. Like we basically.
Well, Yassir, because the MVM they use this like the hadith of I've got it here. Whoever amongst you sees an evil, let him change it with his hand. If he's unable, then with his tongue, and if he's unable, then with his heart. That is the weakest of faith. So I think they pull from I guess Islamic sources and use that in order to basically vote.
So the idea itself of empowering Muslims or calling for mobilization, there's nothing wrong with that, and it could be well, absolutely, it is religiously enshrined and part of our faith. But they're speaking down to us as a community, and they've overasserted our agency without telling us how that agency works in a racial system designed to limit our agency. So they under theorize about colonial legacies that shape our political invisibility. For example, Muslims are very visible. Muslims do a lot. Muslims have participated in the system. Muslims have done so much work to normalize themselves and so forth. And then we have to ask, and yet our political invisibility when it comes to issues of Palestine or, Islamophobia or peeling back some of the CVE stuff has gone missing. Like and this is the same cast of people. Don't get like the same people running this were the ones telling us to do interfaith dialogue a decade or two ago, and then they're telling us to do any form of representative politics through media and contact theory, like just get to know all who we really are. And then they did the open mosque and they did CVE as well, a lot of them, right? And suddenly now these peak bodies and these leaders are telling us we need to wake up. Well, if Muslims are asleep, it's your failure. It's been 20 years of you telling us, and then you're the ones who invited politicians over. We had Morrison at the steps of Lakimba on Eid. You keep having these iftars left, right, and center, and suddenly you're telling us we're being taken for granted. No, they took you for granted. There was plenty of us who knew that it wasn't what it was, right? So this pedagogy of like, wake up, we haven't done enough, we've got to educate them. I got to be convinced by it. Show me. There's an implicit assumption here that they're the politically educated and the Muslim community isn't. Like, what a hubris! Like, subhanallah. Like, where did you get that assumption from? It may be true, I don't know, but you've just owned it. And what happens is there's a psychology here. We have to sit here and explain why we are the way we are. We have to explain why we can't assert our political agency when it comes to Palestine and other things. And so what do? We internalize. We blame ourselves. We're not doing enough. Muslims are asleep. We're talking to us as if we are like, an uneducated caste. And that's simply not true. They rather believe that the Muslim is the problem than the system is built in a way to make us a problem. And that for me is staggering. So instead of recognizing the refusal of this order to accommodate for Muslim grief and dissent, the refusal for our anger around what's happening, that refusal that has been persistent all the way for decades, suddenly now it's like we need to wake up. I don't know, man. And it's like a parenting style where you keep telling your kids, try harder, do more, try harder, do more. But yeah, like there are real barriers, and I would like you to speak about barriers. And at the end of the day, it's just another form of moralism, and that's what they're really, really good at. That's what these professional casts are really, really good at, morally preaching to all of us.
So if you don't vote, then you don't have a say, and if you don't have a say, that's your fault, right?
What? Sorry. Go on, continue, please.
Yes, and so with the systems here, and it's there for us to use. And we know that if quote unquote, the certain people of certain faiths, Semitic or otherwise, the Jewish faith, for example, they use the system. They know how to use the system, and they use their lobbying inside and parliament, and they're able to get policies in. And we're so far behind, and like if it took Palestine for us to get here, well, so be it. Let's just get on with the task.
This is the ongoing thing about they create this binary between something v nothing. It's just a collective defensive mechanism, in my opinion, projection onto the state. This idea of a just, arbitrary kind of like father figure that will be reasoned with and reformed, and the Jewish community is doing it better than us. This just masks the trauma of racism, that we're excluded because of who we are. It's just a fantasy of inclusion. But let's get to the nitty gritty of what you're saying. Because that wish to be heard is a bit of a denial of the reality. But let's get to that crux, because it's been said to me 100 times that what you said, like if you don't vote, something like, what was it? If you're on the sideline, you're kind of like to blame. You have a say, and you said it. The system is there for us. It's not.
Yeah, it's there for us to use, and so why don't we use it?
So yeah, it's like at least they're doing something practical.
Yeah, at least we're doing something.
Yeah, you're just sitting there complaining, etc., etc. This is kind of an ongoing victim blaming.
And complaining is easy, and critiquing is.
Yeah. It's kind of mirrors the Islamophobic tropes that anybody who's not any Muslim who's not participating in the political system and order is somehow the wrong psychology, is like negative in their disposition, overly critical, not practical, not willing to work with. Yeah, so it's kind of like there's something damaged about you if you don't participate in democracy, right? So the first point is that they haven't offered a solution. This isn't something v nothing. They've appropriated the word solution. That's two different things. They haven't offered a solution. They've relied on centuries worth of ideological promotion of liberal democracy as a representative thing. And then they've relied on that ideology that's come through film, media, politicians, mainstream news, that's come so common sense that they believe in and of itself that the system is what it says it is, right? And the problem, therefore, is not the system itself, it's that we're not good enough, right? So they haven't provided. That's not a solution. That's an aspiration that democracy works, and that we just have to pull the lever enough for it to give us what we need. And we have to distinguish, therefore, between action and delusion. So not all motion is a movement. If the lever is broken, pulling it harder won't change what you do to it. It just exhausts us. And I'm not cynical. I'm not negative. I'm rational. I observe what has been happening for the last 100 years and in my lifetime since September 11. And I see particular contours and shape of power when it comes to the Muslim world and the Muslim. And I've seen the perpetual failures of this system to be able to represent or make our lives matter. After all of those years, the question isn't, am I cynical? The question is, why are you hopeful? All right. Now, you may say it's a religious disposition, then pitch it that way. Tawakkal Allah. I don't even, this system is corrupt and whatever. Don't speak as if it works, because you're now you're an architect of the liberal myth making, right? So that's the thing. Secondly, this is not a choice between doing something and doing nothing. If there is a choice of doing something and doing nothing, I am suggesting that the critic of MVM is doing something and MVM is doing nothing, if we account for practical outcomes. The critic of MVM is involved in a serious education about barriers, about realities. The MVM crowd are rushing over those barriers with poetic, motivational pep talks about lift yourselves up. I don't concede to them that they're a solution. I don't. You only speak as if you're a solution if you brought an outcome. You're at the stage where you're pitching hope. And that's not the same thing. So I don't think they get to say that. Now, the issue about when they say things like that, it really deflates me, because it shows to me they don't know how to read politics. We're not the same as the Jewish community, and we can't be the same for all sorts of reasons. Israel, for whatever you want to say about it, is and has been, since its inception, politically aligned with the West. And it's made sure it's that. It's embedded in American politics. Zionism is not just a Jewish doctrine now. It's also a Christian or particular type of Christian doctrine, right? There are people who genuinely believe Israel should exist because the Bible says so. Israel is a political ally, an economic ally and tied to the Western European bloc, and their security and geopolitical interests are tied. And Australia is part of that bloc. So it is easy for me to lobby any of you if we're moving in the same direction. It's easy. I can say, hey, you're going that way anyway. Why don't you do this? This is the best way to get you to where you want to get. Now, they've collectively used Islamophobia and the war on terror to advance the empire's interest, whether it be Iraq, whether it be in Iran, whether it be Syria, whether it be Palestine, whether it be even, right, their position against China. Australia is slightly different. But so then when we start talking about ourselves as a counterweight to the Israeli pressure, and we can somehow convince this neutral Australia to take the interests, honestly, it just tells me you don't know, you have so much faith in this system that you actually believe it's nothing more. It's non-civilizational. It's not Christendom. It's not European. It's just neutral. And then it's only what we make of it. And that is the liberal myth. And I don't know how much evidence you need over the last 100 years to challenge that myth. I don't know what you need. Right now, they can kill hundreds of children, displace millions, destroy Gaza, and then the Sky News will have a summit about the growing nature of anti-Semitism in Australia. And you can see those are orbiting around institutions. Now, I'm not dismissing anti-Semitism and so forth, but you can see quite clearly there's an ideological investment in protecting a particular order and an almost horrifying silence about the lives of Muslims in Palestine, Muslim Arabs and so forth. If you can't see that this is civilizational, then this is what bothers me. Why are you in politics? What are you doing educating? So I think if you disagree with me or disagree with this argument, you owe us an education of why it's wrong. You owe us a way of telling us, yes, the Zionist lobby is powerful, and yes, there's a geopolitical interest between Australia tied to the US, right? But voting can undo that, and this is how. You owe us that argument, and they don't do that. I haven't seen it.
Has the last couple of years demonstrated something for us, at least, or for the whole world, as how the system, the whole geopolitical architecture and institutions that drive it, are very, very motivated to preserve very specific interests at all costs. And in thinking about that, in understanding also a bit of the history in Palestine and Gaza, we realize that October 7th was essentially, or the events leading up to it, was essentially a dismissal or a rejection of all those democratic processes, the institutions, and that taking, that self-determination, taking their political destiny in their own hands. And here we are, almost actually betraying it.
Yeah, that's one of the. It's a really good point. That's one of the miseducations. I actually think they've misread Gaza, and I think I think they've misread the post-Gaza political moment and movement, and mistaken a few things and missed an opportunity. You know what's a good example of this? Fatma Payman. A lot of them celebrate her as some type of heroic individual that shows us the power of being in the Senate. Well, she got to the Senate because she was part of the Labour Party. So and I remember hearing her speak a couple of days ago, speaking of how heartbroken she was because this was supposed to be the party that believes in human rights. And that line stood out for me. Because if you've gone into politics believing the Labour Party is that, then I have to question how much you know about politics. Sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but you should not be heartbroken. Like, we have two contradictory statements. We say this didn't begin on October the 7th. It's 75 years long. Well, Labour hasn't been in power for 75 years, right? And the Australian position on Israel has been pretty consistently pro-Israel for the entire existence of Israel. Yeah. I think there's a park named after Bob Hawke, man. Like, we have seen the Liberal Party also be very, very pro-Zionist. So I don't, if it took this level of violence and peak end of genocide to see the system, I have a right to ask you, where have you been? Where have you been? And I think they've misread that. Now, Fatma Payman becomes interesting because she took 9 months. 9 months across the floor. And then it's presented as a principled position. Now, that's fine. I'm not criticizing it. It takes courage, all the rest. Yes, she was attacked. So I'm not undermining what she's done. I'm adding something that they've missed. Okay? And what is that? The global response to Gaza, the streets, and the call of the limit of the liberal order, the exposure that international law, mainstream media, democratic institution all failed simultaneously, right? To protect a group of people that weren't part of Western imagination as us, right? That protests, they were the real counterpower. And there was like, they tried to ban TikTok, they tried to create new, that moment, that swelling, those images of 500,000 in London, big ongoing protests here in Australia. And they misread that moment. They did. Then they rushed us back into normative politics. Here was a moment where there was a true, like Walter Benjamin might say, the rush of ideological need to make sense of an event. And they did that. They rushed back to the very system that was being questioned. We needed to pause in that moment, use this moment as an education about the system's failures. But they recentered the faith in the system, subhanAllah. Just as it revealed itself as deeply morally bankrupt, deeply racial. Just in that exact moment, what did they do? They took all of our hurt, all of our anger, and then let's vote. Like, subhanAllah. And that point, yeah, I believe the streets, the protests, TikTok, all were ruptures. The images of the voices, above all, from Gaza and Palestine, the call, right? All of that was the rupture. That's what mobilized things. And that's why it took 9 months for people like Payman to cross the floor. Because all of that swelling and pressure and demand and the cry for free Palestine that happened globally, yeah, put pressure on everyone. That the streets became a mirror for all of us. What are you going to do? To her credit, she did. But the idea that this is proof that the system can have representative, no, without the street, who knows what would have happened? Who knows? Because when Jihad Dib first came out, he was speaking two-side stuff. He was talking about this side and that side and condemning, and then playing that humanitarian theory thing like, oh, this is tragic, all these people are passing. No, you say he did that because he knows that. He knows he can't, as a MP, and just come out and say. So all of that, and not even that, the debate around Hamas. And there's no debate in this country, right? Because it's designated a terrorist organization, and you're going to be in lots of trouble if you, at any shape, way, or form, hint, suggest any type of support. But a lot of people globally would not have protested against Israel if it was just a question of Hamas. A lot of people protested because they knew about Israel's aggression. And so when Parliament and politicians and the highest politicians in our political order come out and do the two-side thing, yeah, that tells us something. Now, this need to continually, it beggars a bit of belief for me. The people who have been most left out by this system are the ones rushing to its logic. Now, you might argue this is the precise moment, Yassir, that we have to defend the liberal institutions. This is the precise moment we have to win democracy back from the political corruption of these Zionists or whoever. I don't know who they're blaming today, but we have to win it back. But that assumption is winning back means it was once upon a time neutral. Now, I just want to ask them a question. Provide me an example in history where Western liberal democracies have been self-correcting the violence of their empire. Just provide me an example. What happens is like 10, 20, 30 years later, Donald Trump will come out and say the Iraq war was a mistake. There'll be no reparations. The damage has been done. They will create beautiful movies about, Vietnam and the tragedy of soldiers surviving that, but no reparations and any reversal of empire's interests are done. Like we all know now, weapons of mass destruction was a lie. What happened to George W. Bush? Nothing. Okay. So show to me that these countries are self-correcting in ways that ensure that violence does not continue, that the empire does not continually roll on. And before you say, let's win it back from what? Win it from what? It's always been like this. And that's the point when everybody harps on about hypocrisies. The West is hypocritical. Is it? Is it? Maybe it speaks in two languages. One, to give you all the impression that it's humanistic, but really it has always been an interested block of power that wants to advance its interest. So I don't know. I think there's a misreading, yeah? And that speaks to your point about a missed an opportunity.
Well, on that point, just a little bit more, digging a little bit deeper, I've even heard concessions of, look, the system is corrupt. We appreciate the system is corrupt. Yeah, we know it's corrupt. We know it's driven by lobbyists and lobbying interests. And in fact, it was in a sort of a recent video that touched on this point. And if we have a minority government, then people in parliament, at least this is the logic, people in parliament now have to negotiate amongst each other, and lobbyists can't just drive things through one dominant party. And that, the system is corrupt, but we could probably sanitize it a little bit and over time a lot. I'm just presenting some of the some arguments.
If they're relying on a minority government or a hung parliament that they can sanitize it a lot, then okay, that's again, it's a hope, it's an ambition. Don't call it a solution. And also, even if they do it for one election cycle, there's no guarantee it won't be reversed. Like lobbyists don't go away. Lobbyists don't just sit there and say, "Hey, the other side won, ma salam, I'm packing up my bags." They'll come back. Like, yeah, look, if that's their belief, then okay. I mean, I can't critique that belief because
on the critiquing point. Like, I think the next point is like, you know what? It's easy to critique, right? The argument here is that we need to engage in politics, and almost the assumption being that politics equals electoral democratic politics, and anything else outside of that is not politics. So we need to engage into politics. You're not engaging into politics. You're just a salty a critiquer from whatever it is, throwing stones. You're not helping the situation, and you're demotivating us. It's your job is easy.
No, critiquing the system is not easy. It's very, very, very opposite from easy. Participating in moral and political cliches and advocating them as the solution is far easier than being a critic. It's simply not true. And you know this by now because you silence yourself and censor yourself in particular spaces. You silence and censor your robust position on Palestine in particular spaces. The idea that being critical is easy is another form of gatekeeping that is racialized incidentally through psychologically profiling all critics of democracy as, again, the wrong type of citizen. They're dark in their disposition. They're on the sidelines. They're like some type of stick in the mud, negative Nelly or whatever. It's just a defense that the system has always had to deny or erase any form of legitimacy. Sorry. Yeah. So yeah, it's just a defense to deny any form of legitimacy. Politics outside of the system. So yeah, I mean, I do have solutions. I'm happy to give a solution towards the end of this podcast if that helps them and helps us discuss this, because that again is the constant argument on that. This is the part that I'm really frustrated by. I've seen screenshots they're really problematic in the way they speak to critics. There's a form of gatekeeping. I've seen friends be called keyboard warriors. You're not doing anything. You're just complaining. And there's a speaking down to them. Like I've seen them do that, and that's really like for me. If you have more faith in the electoral system to the point that you're unconsciously being Islamophobic to Muslims who don't believe in the system by psychologically profiling them as bad citizens, unproductive citizens, not as somebody who's another example of this is like don't fall for the fear mongering of not that liberals will win. It's not fear mongering. It's a genuine fear. I've got trauma from the Liberal Party. I don't know what you guys are talking about. Yeah, it's scary for a liberal to be in power. Of course it is. And I remember American Muslims advocating for Donald Trump, and who's it? Sami Hamdi saying it can't get worse under Trump than it did under Biden. Yes, it can. Absolutely, it can get worse. I don't know what these people mean. Like, and then that pep talk, don't be scared. No, don't say that to your community. Your community has a right to be scared. All right? And they're not scared, they're also angry. Right? They're hurt. And this idea of like, again, this psychological profiling of the unwanted citizen, like at least provide space for these brothers and sisters that don't have faith in the system because they make sense. I'm sorry, MVM, you don't make sense. You're irrational. To your point, yeah, we know the system's corrupt. Let me give you another example, bro. They say this I used this analogy before. They're like, yeah, we know there's a hole in the bucket. We do know there's a hole in the bucket. Everyone knows the hole, but you're not saying something new yet. So there is a hole in the bucket. It is corrupt. But then they pour water into the bucket. And then you ask, well, why are you pouring water into a bucket that you know is corrupt? And now, because at least we're doing something. What are you doing? And then they're going to say, well, we're hoping that while doing this, the bucket will be fixed. And what I'm trying to say, what if the quote unquote corruption is the actual faith in a corrupt system? What if that is the purest form of corruption, that you believe in it, right? And it relies on your belief in it, because there's nothing safer for them to watch this swelling street, this anger, this crisis that Israel, an ally, that the US and Western powers have this moment. They're seeing international law and everything that they've advocated as a form of governance in this post-colonial world being challenged. The empire and the emperor's clothes has been stripped off. There's nothing more than they want from us to say, let's go to the electoral cycle to get the right type of politician, right type of parliament. They want that. They want that. And
the point that you put there reminds me of a quote that a commentator in the UK said during the UK elections. And he said that rather than, or more or less, I'm paraphrasing, rather than the Muslim community disengaging from democratic politics, they sought to engage. And he thought that this was he was mentioning this is progress for the community, that rather than like letting go of it all and saying that, hey, this is hopeless and this is it's not going to do us.
So that's the point. Like at the end of the day, let's break this binary once and for all. It's not between something and nothing, engagement, disengagement. It is simply this: if we have limited resources, limited time, limited capacity to create change, and we have to be very strategic and intelligent about how to mobilize those resources for the most impactful outcome. These guys are mobilizing all of our resources, all of our hope, all of our anger, all in the hope of, I think, a hung parliament or something, or a minority government, or a representative politics again and again and again. A notion that we just have to be what I call the correct temperature Muslim. We just have to be the right type again and again and again and again. It's not a question of engagement or disengagement for me, but I get the quote. It's a question of how can we channel, despite all of these barriers, read the map, understand the geography, take what we have and build something that is reflective of us and is rewarding politically with respect to the energy we put into it. All that energy, bro, all that energy spent on interfaith dialogue as some form of countering Islamophobia. Where has it gotten you? All of that work done on the idea of a representative politics. We need more Muslims in media. We need Muslims in sport. We need Muslims in parliament. All of that. And when it came to protecting children in Palestine, it counted for nothing. Nothing. So you just reflect, right? And then say, well, how can we properly use all of our resources? We're not a poor community. We're not an uneducated community, despite what they want to say about us. They speak to us as if we're like backward immigrants that need to be told what democracy is. We're not any of these things. We're none of these things. Like, so in that sense, this is purely instinct from them. Like they have bought into, they've internalized the aggression. Anybody who's not orthodox is framed as ill, politically ill. They don't have the right temperature, basically.
Can I give you another perspective on this? Or I want to get you to comment on this one. Well, democracy in Australia isn't like democracy back home, right? If you go to the Muslim world and you talk about democracy and the possibilities with it, most people will laugh at you, right? Or they'll at least roll their eyes at least once or twice. But when you come to Australia, when you come to the West, any of these quote unquote civilized countries, suddenly the perspective changes.
So you're saying once we're here, we believe in it more than we do back home, right?
And why is that the case?
Well, but that's because they've made a separate. So a big part of the racial profiling of what colonial order made was a distinct set of two world orders: a zone of being, zone of non-being, if you will. The colonizer's world is one that's functioned and neat and makes sense and is transparent and counters its own corruption and is what it says it is. The zone of non-being back home is corrupt and ad hoc and ultimately full of lies and oppression and violence led by the gun and so forth and whatnot. So there is elements of truth about the way violence plays out, but the system is the same thing. We are what we are because they are what they are. The rich don't become rich without creating the poor, right? In that way. And so the powerful don't become powerful without suppressing others. And, freedom is not an exhaustive principle in this world order. That means some people's freedom comes at the expense of others. So it doesn't strike me as surprising that when we migrate from our world, quote, home, and come to this world, we internalize certain racial mythologies about the superiority of political order. And then you come out and Australia looks like it makes sense, right? It works, the streets are clean and the ticking man is working. People cross the road and obey traffic lights. And if I go to Egypt, it's chaotic, it's crazy. And then there's an assumption, and this is what racism does, that there's something psychological about the nature of the Egyptian v. the psychological nature of the Australian, that we have some type of better political order. Of course, wealthier states are better run. Of course they are, right? The point that we've always tried to get this system is that the wealth was taken from places like Africa to build Europe. And you cannot assess one world without assessing the other. They're cyclical. And so that cyclical material nature of colonialism also had an ideological narrative, and it was a racialized narrative. We are the way we are because we're better. They are the way they are because they're inferior. And it translates to political systems. America can do all that America does and still champion itself as the beacon of freedom. And people buy it. People believe it. UK can do all that it's done and then still talk as if it's the land that presented to the world, human rights and freedom and tolerance of minorities. So that's part of it. And ultimately, MVM and others have internalized this, even in the moment they say they haven't, because I don't believe. Let me just pause here. A lot of people think ideology is stuff that floats in your head, right? It's thoughts that you have, loyalties that you have. One of the things liberalism does, and I've got to give credit to it, or liberal order, or liberal society, is the best way to feel free is to believe that you're critical of media, of government, of institutions, of lobby groups. However, you wake up and you behave and act like they aren't corrupt. That's ideology for me. You know the politician, when he's kissing the baby and trying to get your votes, is performing, but you vote for him anyway, right? You know when they say, we're here to free you from student debt, they're just trying to get your vote, but you believe in it anyway, because ultimately they allow you to believe you're a cynic, and they don't really care if you are, as long as if you behave like you're not. And so my question to them is like, if you genuinely believe it's corrupt, why are you behaving like it's not? That's a question. And they may be able to answer it, but at the moment I haven't got an answer. Like, I haven't heard it. Maybe you guys have, but I haven't heard it. And so, yeah.
Well, let's move on to the next point, because as much as the politics and the democratic system, there's ideology that runs it, but there's an element of it. It's just mathematics as well, right? Voting comes down to numbers, and numbers get crunched, and based on the preferential system that we have here, at least, certain candidates or parties win or lose, right? So if it's just a bunch of numbers, MVM have looked at the numbers, they've looked at the seats, and there's quite a few seats. I think there's up to about 20, I think, or so, that can be swung this way or that way. So away from Labor, which Labor's very bad right now, and it can be swung. It could be swung to an independent, or to the Greens, or to another minor party. And so it's also a matter of maths. And if we've done the maths, and we see that there's a percentage of Muslim population in a particular seat, all it will take is just essentially all those Muslims voting in one direction, and that's the only variable we're looking at, and that's how we could get there. And if we do that across different places in different areas in Australia, we could get a big swing. We could be kingmakers.
There's two arguments against this. First one is the myth of the Muslim bloc, Muslim voting bloc, and the second argument is, even if they were correct and they did that, I suspect they got their numbers from previous electoral elections. The last federal election, I think they looked at the numbers and then they did the census data and they created figures in their head. I think that's what they've done. I don't know, right? But even if they were right and the fiction of a Muslim bloc came into fruition and they created these swings and they became kingmaker, I still don't know what they think they'll achieve. Like, there's still a belief that Parliament is going to be responsive to your cause. It's still a belief. Like, majority of political decisions are made in Canberra around Parliament through various different deal making, lobbying, and so forth. There's still a belief that it's almost, so forgive me, it's regressive. Like, we get into Parliament, we speak our truth, we make these deals, we represent our people. Like, if you believe that, then you fine. MashaAllah. You still have to come and say, this is how we're going to overcome the corruption of a system that's built on lobbying and powerful interest groups that will curtail and undermine any democratic processing. Okay? You still have to counter your own argument that it's corrupt. So that's the first question. Like, even if all of the fantasies came true, Muslims voted in a bloc, a hung parliament, minority parliament happened. You got swings in and you sent a message to Labor, and all of that happened. Then what? You still haven't answered that. There's an assumption that there's some type of victory in that. Okay, as unlikely as it is, you must still believe that. Look, listen, man. They've suspended international law. They've defunded UN organs in America. There's an attack against an international global idea of human rights, right? They've curtailed university for academic free speech when it comes to being critical of Israel. Do you think they're just going to hand over the keys to Parliament? Like, there'll be no pushback? There'll be no pressure that the media, it'll be a game and that's power. But that second criticism is a question to them. The first criticism is even more problematic for me because it tells me the Muslim voting matters crowd don't know who Muslims are. Like, it tells me you don't know your own people. Like, the fiction of a politically coherent Muslim that has no internal fractures and the colonial legacies that's been put into place for us to be disunited. Bro, it happens at our own community level. I'll tell you now, I don't think Board of Imams, Victoria, and their constitute and their crowd will not vote for Labour. I don't think that at all. I don't think plenty of Muslims won't vote the way MVM tells them to vote. I don't see this block. But then this idea that Muslims can be mobilized into a single block moving in a particular direction based on numbers, and then they can only do that. They can only do that on the question of Palestine. That's it. But then they sneak in other things like housing affordability and, I don't know, was it climate change and questions around Indigenous Australia and gambling. Like, when did you introduce all those things? Because Muslims aren't united on any of those things. We're united on Palestine, but we're not united on the issue of how to solve Palestine. Right? We're united on the anger and the hurt. So you've taken that and said, hey, Muslims are going to vote in a particular block. And if, subhanAllah, if we had a block, if we could mobilize Muslims in a particular direction, if you could fantasize that way, why not use that block internally to self-determine us by building better and strengthening our existing institutions? If we were all stitched together in a collective consciousness, then racism would have lost. But we're not. Okay, we're divided across ethnic, sectarian, class, ideological lines. We're fragmented. And it's not incidental, man. That's a product of this colonial governance that's reinforced time and time again, this kind of modern racial capitalism. There's no way people moving up the social mobile ladder are not going to think about voting for Liberal for their own business interests. Bro, I don't know what these people are talking about. They hear the word Muslim and they regress to like our childlike Islam when we're all united and moving in a single direction. We disagree about everything. Our peak bodies fighting each other, right? Every Muslim board there is, we're at a school level, everywhere is in contest, right? And that's the result and the legacy of colonial governance. And they treat these divisions as if they're accidental or unfortunate and without any resources, public campaigning, anything. That somehow we're just going to give you a shiny pamphlet and then you're going to vote in the right direction. And as I said, the only way, and this angers me, they can potentially create a movement is on Palestine. And so you're now exploiting Palestine for all this other rubbish.
All right, let's get to that point.
Real quick. Can I add something real quick, Abdullah? So regarding what you're saying, like MVM sort of came out, you can say in a reactionary manner, as after October 7th and Israel's actions, all that sort of stuff. And then prior to that, like we were discussing offline, a lot of the Muslims were pushed to vote for the Liberal Party because of LGBTQ, right? So like that kind of, going back and forth like a yo-yo, there hasn't been any strategizing in a long-term way. So like, what's to say, like people, like you were mentioning, like MVM are kind of saying to us like, oh, we're just criticizing or whatever.
So I remember being at ICV and that different events when Kevin Andrews came and visited the school and all the rest. And prior to October the 7th, there was the LGBTQ scare and the community was mobilizing against the idea that there was, too much conceded, that Labour was too weak, that the Greens were promoting LGBTQ so aggressively that our kids were in danger. People live in the country, weren't they? They were like flying back to Turkey or something because...
Yeah, it's not even a joke. Like I have friends that are like talking about Hijra because of LGBTQ.
Yeah, and so I was at ITV and I was confused. And like they were getting, like, I'm not making this up, they were getting in bed with and creating allies with Orthodox and conservative Christian and Jewish groups to fight back against the LGBTQ agenda. And I literally asked them on the day, like, what about Palestine? You're in bed with Zionists. And they said to me, they'll cross that bridge when it comes. And it came on October the 7th. And now suddenly we're flipping the other side of the vote. Now we're moving away from, there's all this critique against the left and the leftists. And because after Black Lives Matters and the Me Too movement and the apparent rise of critical race theory and quote unquote woke culture, we saw this massive alt-right white supremacist backlash. A lot of Muslims jumped on it through the manosphere and elsewhere. And they were bashing the left. And yet globally we look, the left is one of the most solid allies when it comes to Palestine, and now they've jumped to the left side to attack the conservatives. They can't. This is the point. You're going to jump back and forward, and the idea that somehow this system is built for you, it's not. And the question you have to ask them and ask ourselves: is there certain things about being Muslim? Is there certain things about Islam that are simply unrepresentable in this system? Is there certain things? And they don't answer that question, because you can get to the highest station within media. Like, we have people who have won gold logies, people like they've got a platform, and they worked off the back and worked through and within the community to get there. And they know that they can't say certain things, which means there are certain things about us that is simply unrepresentable, right? And so I don't know, like, it seems we're like a flag flapping around in the wind. Whenever the direction goes that way, we go with it. Whenever it's that way, we go with it. And that's the opposite of self-determination.
Yeah, the latest pamphlet said, and I quote, "We're not outnumbered, and we're not we're just out-organized." I think that was said. Yeah, that's a quote. That talks to me.
How are we not outnumbered? And unless this is code, like dog whistling to say we're not outnumbered for the Jewish community, I don't know who they're talking about. How are we not outnumbered?
As in, we can swing places, maybe, or we've got friends.
It goes back to my friend. So, okay, we swing places. Then what, bro? Then what? You get your dream outcome. Also, can I just say, I just don't understand why they don't treat politics as if it's a contest. Do you know that if you build a Muslim bloc, hypothetically, and it comes to fruition, right, in one election cycle, you are also socially engineering a stronger Islamophobic bloc, right? So you have to be sure that your Muslim bloc can be stronger than the Islamophobic bloc. Because I'll tell you now, one of the things that they will do is they will advocately. Now, I don't think that means you should stop doing it. I don't believe in adhering or cowering because Islamophobia rises. However, there's this, again, they treat politics like this open meadow of possibility. And I do believe in possibilities, radical ones though, right? But they can only come from understanding the system. So this question, we're not outnumbered. It's a pep talk, bro. I swear, it's just motivational speak. It's like it's like somebody wants to go to the gym and they're going to try and get bigger. It's like, you can do it. Yes, you can. You're the man. Like, calm down, bro. It's not real. It's like they're treating us as if we're Moana and we're on our way to getting the heart of Tafiti or something, bro. Like, it's not politics. And when you speak to Muslims like that infantilizing way, right? You're implicitly growing a seed in the back of our head that if we kind of like, because we're unorganized, this is the outcome, this is the result. I still need to have the question answered. If we were super organized, right? What would that mean? Tell me, spell it out. Because it could mean that you become, quote unquote, Zionist Lobby 2.0. And then I ask you a question. Do you really want to be that? Do you really? Do you really want to motor along with Western civilization? Do you? And what if your liberation came at the expense of, say, I don't know, Southern Sudanese groups, indigenous people? Do you really want that? Like, okay, because for a long, long time, anti-racism is trying to escape the yoke of these institutions. These guys are trying to run towards it. They want to integrate into the system as opposed to find freedom from it. Like, let's say you became Zionist Lobby 2.0. Is that in accordance to who we are as a people? Is that what we want? Maybe, and I've often said this, Islamophobia hurts, yes. It kills, yes. It does all of these things, but ultimately, put your faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it could be in the long run a benefit, because it prevented us by being consumed by this system. It spat us out and it created resistance and ability to read this system. If Palestine doesn't happen, now, astaghfirullah, I'm not saying it, Allah's the planner, but it happened, and then we get to see, this is the moment where we get to understand. We get to understand the corruption of this society. Why do you want to belong to it? Why? Why? Create your own world, man. And so this fantasy goes back to the Muslim bloc. Like, you don't know your people. You don't know your community. Like, bro, I've been doing politics for 20 years, right? And they haven't. One of them reached out to me and then realized I was a critic and then stopped talking to me. All right. Here's a fantasy. Like, I am in contest with you and you can't bring me to a table to discuss things with me. And I'm not alone. And if you can't see the division then between us, then the possible benefit of MVM is lost. And what is the possible benefit? Let us all properly debate voting. Let's do it. But I've gone to, and friends have gone to events, and they actually over police critics. They really do. And so that, again, is another policing thing. And I just want to close on this point about the Muslim voting bloc. Guys, the Muslim community is fundamentally akin to a kind of policing agency. We are a management community. We don't have leaders, we have managers. We're put into place to manage social cohesion for Australia, manage political excesses and so forth. Until you understand what the community is and what the people is and the kind of racial stresses are on our heads, the way for example, I said, what's unrepresentable about us? Our anger is unrepresentable. That's why reports like Islamophobia Register will overemphasize our fear of being Muslim in Australia, because they can't represent our anger. And the majority of us are angry. We're angry at what's going on. That can't be represented. So that anger is managed. It's all managed. And so until you understand these stresses, talking about a Muslim voting bloc or whatever is just, for me, ultimately, it erases both the need for a collective introspection about where we are, a need for mutual repair, a need for healing about the contests around our differences and what's going on. And above all, it erases the political imagination that's required to create that bloc. What we need to do to come together beyond state-structured notions of voting. All of it gets lost in this very cheap, cliche-driven idea of Muslims voting in a bloc. Like, so much khair is potential in the idea of coming together, having contests, having debates, having disputes, understanding our differences, and they just erase it all. Erase it. And with a fantasy, mind you. They can't erase it in reality. So then they've turned, and this is your point about the data, they've turned political struggle into demographics, into numbers. You're reduced to a number. They've oppressed and reduced us to a statistical function. Okay? We don't learn anything from each other. We're not redeemed as subject. And that bloc, that fiction of a bloc, I should say, erases any mess of the Muslim community and its history and its loss and its betrayal and its exile. None of it's there. But between each other, like, I have issues with our peak bodies. Like, it's just assumed we're all in it together, and we're not. I have issues, and you haven't been able to hear those issues. So this fantasy of a wholeness is a regression. As I said, it's a childlike type of a reimagination of the ummah, and it's a defense against our actual fragmentation that's come from colonial governance. And I'm all for a yearning for unity, mind you, but not as a way to compensate the reality of our internal conflicts. Like, it's just a repression. And so I don't know what else to tell you other than they haven't proven, they haven't shown it, and it's very unlikely that it exists. Khair.
Okay. Moving on from that, because I know that whole idea that, because when it comes down to numbers, I've had people crunch numbers as well, and they've had, I think in the UK they had someone who was a statistical guy who does I forget the term of the occupation, but they looked at it from that thing, and I think that's a really big one of the big marketing points is that, look, these numbers sort of make sense. A plus B equals C, and these sort of machinations can lead us in a particular direction. And I've got sort of issues around the clarity around that, but there's clarity around other things too, right? Or the lack of, and that's around what the objectives are, what the point of this is, in the sense is it about Palestine? Because we know that if it's about changing foreign policy is in line with Western, with our quote unquote allies, US, UK, that doesn't get voted in Parliament. That's never has been a point of discussion or a point of contestation on that level, at least. Is it okay if it's not about Palestine? Then okay, what is it? Is it about getting us more mosques, getting us a little bit more Islamophobia funding? Is it about now? It's about climate change. It's about having a fair go in Australia.
I don't know. It's a good. Look, I'm always confused by them. I don't know what they're. There's certain things I don't like. I said talking down to Muslims, the self blame stuff. I mean, I can acknowledge that people have different politics and don't have to read the word through a colonial lens. They don't have to, but I do think they owe us a contest. I mean, there's no point calling people cynical and they're not providing reasons why they're not cynical. But yeah, the vagueness and whether it's about Palestine, it's a really good question. I don't even know what they're at. Like, they're talking about Muslim-friendly candidates and scorecards and all the rest. And again, the other sides are just going to be neutral. Like, they're just going to put a bunch of Muslim names on, and you're not going to know who's who. And like, politics is a dirty game. I don't know how it's going to work out. But I go back to the initial point. Even if they get what they want, I still don't know what they think the outcome is, right? Because even if they somehow, all the numbers are crunched correctly and there's a hidden genius there that people like me, you, and others cannot see, they still have to answer the question, because there is a kind of like, the solution is in the outcome. If we do this, we win. Win what? Like, there's a couple of worst case scenarios for them. I think Liberal coming into power is pretty messed up. But if Labour wins, right, after all of your posturing, we're going to punish Labour. We're not going to be taken for granted. If Labour still wins and you did all of this, you basically signal to Labour, you've got no impact. You're now a social experiment to prove there's no such thing as a Muslim bloc. And any fiction of it before or after, they may not be able to speak to it. Yeah? That's the first thing. And then secondly, who are they to decide what is Muslim friendly? This is, again, the myth of a unity. Who are you to tell me what I want as a Muslim when it comes to political ideals, right? As I said, the only thing that they can probably rely on is that there's a significant amount of Muslims who are pro-Palestine, yeah? And but being pro-Palestine is not the same thing as having all the same solution to Palestine. So I don't even know what they're talking about in that sense. But look, I'm going to be quite harsh about this. I'm going to say this. They do. I genuinely believe this. I'm sorry. I hope they forgive me for saying it. But I have to be honest. They do appropriate the rage of Gaza. And then they dilute it into policy jargon. They literally take our age and make us shadow box. And they move from blood to bureaucracy in a click. This is an evolution. And this is the point, they always present this as some type of maturity. And that posturing, that is so Islamophobic to me. This is how I interpret it. Because that maturity, the rage is mature. The rage is mature. The rage is a God-given right. After watching 18 months of our Muslim brothers and sisters being slaughtered, that rage is maturity. You translating it into, like, or blaming Labour for that matter. I don't even know what, like, they must have had faith in Labour.
We want to punish Labour, right? We want to send Labour a message. I'm like, okay,
punish them. And in a two-party system, that means rewarding liberals, by the way. But they're like, oh no. I remember one of them telling me, this is fascinating. Again, every time I engage with them, I lose a notch of faith in them. I remember saying it's a two-party system, and they're like, no, it's not. This is just paper. They started talking about democracy on paper, like the way it's written up. It shouldn't be a two-party system. And then one of them said, I think she's a doctor somewhere, and I don't mention names, but said across Europe, the faith in two-party politics is diluting, and independent parties are growing. This is a key moment. And what they forget, and this is what they didn't want, what they neglected of saying, yes, that's partly true, but that's because of the rise of far-right groups, right? Hyper-populist, hyper-nationalist, xenophobic groups, right? That's the reason why they've lost faith, because now two parties are seen as too mainstream and corrupt against white European majorities. And then they took that as some type of advantage. Right? People are losing faith. Yes, they're losing faith because of your existence here in Australia as a citizen. Okay. Again, more faith. So, punishing Labour. Why Labour?
So then,
again, why Labour? You're going to tell me, because that's the thing. This is what I don't like about people who are new to politics or new to crisis. Gaza does not happen in a vacuum. Okay. And if you had faith that the Labour Party could stop it, could stop Israel, then you don't know politics. And so you coming in, we've got to punish them, is the belief that they had enough power to stop it. The existing sitting government, because you don't know the difference between government and state, right? The Australian state cannot do this.
Well,
It risks so much.
What if we tone it down one little notch in a sense that say that to remove Australia from participating in it? Yeah,
I don't think they can do that. I mean, look, you know what the best pathway to hope is? Trump is so crazy that he does actually live by his word of an America first and cuts allegiances with, I don't know. I'm also creating fantasies here. And Australia now is somewhat independent and can focus on West Europe and so forth, or maybe China, and create new political allegiances. Then maybe in that moment it can reimagine its relationship in the Middle East. Possibly. But there's so much of Australia's security is reliant on the US. They're not going to risk that for us. They're not. So much of its economic growth is reliant on so unless that relationship changes, yeah. And incidentally, Australia's always nominally said they're pro two-state solution. Normally try to play both sides, sort of thing. I mean, recently Labor has, most of the time the UN resolutions are pro-Israel. And we've seen some changes for Labor in the wake of the genocide. That is unprecedented. But blaming Labor, punishing Labor is a confusion. This is what I mean. For me, I don't care who's Prime Minister. I really don't. I do think there will be, because I think parties and consensus and cabinet and all that will shape the nature of that Prime Minister. On a secondary level, I do believe some parties stress different interests over another. On a third level, I do think the state has bipartisan and geopolitical interests tied together. So I try to read the whole thing. These guys still believe in, like, if we get the right type of people, we can have a democracy. Doesn't wait. They don't know about, they seemingly haven't presented about the nature of how. Oh, I also, forgive me, I think there's a confusion between democracy and liberalism. Liberalism spreads the idea of human rights, freedom, individual agency. We are all representative and so forth. Democracy is a bureaucratic system that curtails too much influence, and it's an administrative system that ultimately distributes decision-making, right? So the idea that you get the right people in the right place, then those decision-making can be done by only those in power is a bit strange. But yeah, look, it's also this. I was being maybe unfair when I said they're appropriating the rage of Gaza. At another level, they're sublimating their own trauma about Gaza. Right? It's unbearable pain for all of us witnessing this genocide. And something in says, we have to do something. We have to punish those people in power. That becomes their calling, right? They have to do it. And that's a more generous reading, but they still should not be speaking down to us. They should be inviting ongoing debate and contest around whether democracy is an avenue for us. They just didn't do that.
And that's not very democratic, is it?
Well, that's the other thing. Like, if you want to ask me, like, if you want Muslim votes to matter, I've said this before, make it matter where it counts. Like, why are our own organizations and peak bodies who work as managers for the government not open to representation, not open to voting, not open to democratic norms? Why? And so I'm going to answer a question, if you don't mind, about something I've always been criticized of. You don't offer solutions, which is it's not true. I do. It's just what they mean by solutions is give us a blueprint, give us a map that will work within the existing order in a particular way where I can see it happening and I will not be harmed or punished by doing that work, right? So the solution has a lot of unstated criteria and what they're about, yeah? So an alternative to MVM is, and I've said it before and time again, is a self-determined community power without the need from a permission. That means when we don't need to start from scratch. We've built this. Our communities already have these institutions, mosques, schools, welfare programs. We've got a media platform, right? We've got MLN as a legal advocates. These need to be strengthened. They need to be invested in. But many of them have also been compromised. And we have to have a counter politics for transparency in order for our peak bodies not to be compromised. They're too often checked by government grants. Don't you find it interesting that every definition of Islamophobia that comes from these peak bodies doesn't criticize government, doesn't criticize policing, doesn't criticize the state. Islamophobia becomes only stuff citizens do to citizens. And we need kind of this like internal regulatory process where we can pressure our own peak bodies, to represent a diversity of our interests through some type of quote unquote democratic process, and push back against the soft policing of social cohesion, which is just another form of countering any excessive views that are not nationalist. Our people, our community, our institutions, put your effort into that. Build that. Like I've said it before, turn the halal meat industry, all right, into something that you can scratch the surface of. For every kilo of meat, $2 goes into some type of regulatory body or some Islamophobia think tank. Teach the community that their own economic, their own political schooling interests can align. Your day job also helps your community, right? Like do like pro bono for legal experts, apprenticeships in medical fields, well-being industries, give free sessions to people who need it in our community. Like build us up. Stop going like I need to go to government to help me. Don't, because government's not going to give you what you want, because government's only going to take what it wants before it throws something back at you. And that's what I mean by it. But this solution for us is a long-term. It's kind of like a parenting thing. We have to reparent, self-parent, move along. It can't come through do A, then B, then C, reduce the Muslim complexities into statistical numbers. This is what will happen, and so forth, right? And ultimately, we have to wrestle from the fact that communities are managed zones by government. They're managed by government, right? And our media is managed by cultural sentiment. And so self-determination is an aspiration, and it has to be worked on. And we have to raise the next generation of kids. I work in an Islamic school, and they don't know anything about the history of Palestine. That doesn't happen in Zionist schools, by the way. Zionist schools send kids to Israel after year 10. They teach everything about Israel. Like they're kind of like socially engineering the next generation of defenders of Israel. We don't do that for anything. We actually just create kids to become good citizens to Australia. And even then, right, they live in these bubbles. We don't even see a critique of Australia. It's just a fiction view of Australia. So like this idea that it's either electoral parliament kind of politics, mainstream politics. No, man. Have a civic, communal ethic. Build your own people. Like genuinely. Like and that solution may take 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Also tie yourselves to other interests. Like we have Malaysia and Indonesia next door. Like there's so many potential projects that can come out of helping build our community through shared and tied values. Like you go to a white supremacist Zionist state in hope that it will advance the interests of Palestine. It won't. It can't, right? And I don't think that's very helpful. So if MVM looks at the ballot box, I think look at Muslim communities and stop. Look, all we do is complain that our organizations are corrupt. Then do something about it. Like genuinely. Like I get called from this sheikh and that sheikh and that sheikh. Like, what are you doing here? What are you doing there? Like, this is corrupt. Do something about it. Listen, bro. Like, if it's true, Allahu alam, I don't want to make speculation. I heard if it's true that a sheikh was involved in somehow grooming a young autistic kid through a CVE program and ultimately leading through family and whatnot to get this kid arrested or looked at, that sheikh should never practice again. But we don't know. We're not even allowed to mention his name. These stories come to me. I don't even know if it's true, bro. It come to me, stuff like that. If that's happening, shame on you, bro. Like, why are you blaming the Labour Party for? What are you blaming the Labour Party for? Seriously. If you go to Islamic schools and they're not teaching about Palestine, why are you blaming the media for? Why? Your own people are. Like, if we're taking selfies with every politician that just simply rocks up and it's like a smile, mashallah, why are you blaming them for? Take accountability, take ownership, right? Our politics and self-determination will determine our needs, and create contests within the community, bro. I promise you, we don't listen to each other. The moment that Yassir is a critic of ICV closes the doors. The moment Yassir is a critic of Anik closes the doors. That is the worst way to do politics. But a politician can say the worst thing about Muslims and Islam and still be invited. on our front steps to give a talk on Eid. They can sign off on anti-terror legislation that hurts our people and still be invited. So there's a lot needed to create these contests. And MVM, look, also, can I just stop and say this? People, if you want to vote, vote. I don't care. Like, I'm not saying don't vote because voting has its things, right? It's the education about what it is, what it will achieve, that bothers me. Because I believe, and I go back to my initial point, it's about miseducation, and it removes the possibilities of self-determination. And all of our imagination, our activity, should be moving in that direction rather than working towards getting government to represent us. MVM can be a strategy post self-determination, but not as a replacement.
Because that's the challenge in terms of looking at the alternative, is that this is here, and how do I imagine a politics outside of this? Literally, and I can't.
I don't determine these arguments, but it's not hard for Muslim schools across the country, not just the ones I work in, to say let's integrate into our history subjects or our social science subjects or even our English subjects our own self and lived experiences. Like, it's not hard. That doesn't require a radical reimagination.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't. Look, this is going to sound strange for me. Like, one of the true successes in the community in the last 20 years for me has been one path. I don't always agree with everything. I don't have to. That's not the point. But yeah, like, one path's done well, man. Like, they're a Muslim, I think. I mean, unless somebody wants to give me a criticism, from what I see on the surface, a Muslim-run Muslim organization that creates Muslim media content for Muslim consumers. Now another media platform should pop up, maybe with a less conservative bend, and so forth. But that's a success. Some of our mosques and MLN could be viewed as a success. Some of our shuras are growing. Certain MSAs have always been, they've got a lot of obstacles against them. This is where our solutions lie, bro. Like, you act like the Jewish community doesn't invest in its own people. Of course it does. Of course it does. It creates positions for them. I won't mention, but there are certain organizations that should be Muslim run, but they're not. They're not. Right? They're run by people from other faiths and other communities, but without getting into it. But yeah, so I agree with you, but let's not give MVM too much credit and say, oh, when they sit there in some type of existential angst, how can we reimagine something outside of the system? It's not that deep. It's not that deep, bro.
I'm just a really good.
Honestly, we could create today, with all the money that they've raised and anybody else and community, we could create an independent, community-run center to study Islamophobia, right? And pay full-time academics and researchers, right, to do at least 1, 2, 3, create transparency, create the need for reports, then use that independent material to then inform media and politicians. But we get, this is amazing to me, bro. We get grants from the state that is involved and has been involved in grooming Islamophobia to justify wars and asylum policies against asylum seekers. We get them to fund us. And I've seen some of the grants. I was speaking to some of the grants. We can't criticize government. You know that, right? We can't. And then secondly, we have, basically it's a form of, how do I say, Muslims doing CVE for the far right. We're helping the government police bad citizens who say bad things to us. And again, it's just like, what? Why wouldn't there be one? Like, if you want government-run Islamophobia things, okay, but why isn't there one body in our community that is independent? That for me is like one body. Like, subhanAllah. And you can have this Malcolm X v Martin Luther King Jr. thing happening. You can have the Islamophobia register, which is for another day. Okay, it's like the stuff that Susan and Miriam are talking about is such. Anyway, I'll stop. Okay,
have an episode on that.
You can have that on top of that. This envoy Islamophobia, you can have that. Like, I'm not going to be naive enough to think that politics isn't going to create socially engineered, well-to-do, integrated, moderate Muslim. It'll always do that, right? You can have that. But the fact that the community has no alternative, no independent body, that you don't need imagination for that, bro. You don't need what's the solution. You don't need to have a moment in the shower alone or taking a walk around in the park trying to figure it out. That is a very simple solution. Yeah. Right.
Okay,
That's a very
final question, Yassir. So elections happening. It's coming. It's going to happen in a few months, how many months? And I, as a Muslim, want to know who to vote for, right? Just asking this question as a hypothetical, of course. I want to know who to vote for, and who should I vote for then, right?
you answer me.
I need someone to tell me what to do.
Why? Again, look, bro. I don't care. I actually don't know what I'm going to do. I haven't even thought about it. Like, I don't care. Partly because if Labour wins, I'll have to react to a political landscape as a result of the election. If Liberal wins, I'll have to react to a landscape. If there is a minority government or a hung parliament, I'll have to react to that landscape. That is to say, I have to assess, for me, when I say I don't care, every outcome will create a different positionality vis-a-vis my Muslim politics as a result. So that's what I'm caring about. So I put less investment. Now, if you want to vote on an ethical principle of not rewarding Labour, if you want to vote on another principle, I don't. It's like when ICV call out the Board of Imams Victoria for being, for me, like when they call the Board of Imams of Victoria out for doing CVE work, I'm like, ICV, be quiet. You've done so much damage with CVE in the past. It took you a long, long time to figure stuff out. Long time. So I'm not gonna, like, for me, all of you have different positionalities within the system, and you have maybe positives and maybe negatives. So I don't see politics that way. My politics is I have to read the system, have to read the room, have to read the climate, have to read the politicians in power. I do think Liberals will be very difficult for us. It's not like it's easy under Labour. Yeah, but also when there could be all sorts of things that come out of this election. Yeah, so I know it sounds flippant and no one wants to hear this answer. For me, it's irrelevant. Not irrelevant, that's the wrong word, sorry. I'm just used to living my life as a Muslim, waiting for the next challenge and the evolution of an existing challenge into a bigger challenge. So I don't have faith. I read the state. I don't read governments. As I read governments within the context of the state, but yeah. No. So vote Australia's voice, yeah? I don't know, like, what do you like? They'll tell you what to vote for, bro. I don't, yeah.
I think that covers most of it.
Is there a point, Abdullah? I don't know if we mentioned this, but how MVM are infusing Australian nationalism into its
So on their website and in some of the so part of the wider appeal, right? Because maybe it's a lack of faith in actually a real Muslim bloc that they needed more support. But there's this Australian nationalism infused in their rhetoric that, hey, we're trying to build a more egalitarian Australia. Muslim vote matters. It's not just for Muslims; it's for all Australia. It's to create a more ethical foreign policy, Islam has got viewpoints on domestic violence. It's got viewpoints on gambling, and so I don't know. This is a different level of Sharia creep. I'm not sure.
Islamophobia doesn't like. So I don't know, bro. It's an interesting one.
And
Sharia creep.
For me, a question is: okay, is this Muslim vote matters? Is this Australia vote matters? Is like, what's the point of being Muslim if it's
as I said, this is the correct temperature Muslim argument that's happened for a long, long time. If only they knew the truth about us. We have the best values. And mashallah, like, I have no problem with dawah as a movement. That for me makes sense. If you want to participate in politics based on your Muslim values, do it. I've got no problem with that. Like, I've got a problem with what they're selling.
If you
want to create parties that are enshrined with Islamic values, mashallah, you should do that in every aspect of your life. But the pitch and what they're selling is two different things.
Yeah,
right? And
the current iteration is overselling the potential and pulling people in, and particularly at a moment where we really need to start questioning and thinking deeper than absolutely just
because for me, I believe in this need for a political education, and but again, I've got to be clear. Doesn't mean you have to agree and see the way I see the world. Actually, no, I wouldn't trust that. I believe that we have to have a contest within the community of continually recognizing because we don't really speak to each other. We speak through them. They provide a language, whether that language is the war on terror, whether that language is October 7 about Hamas, whether it's always us reacting to it. And we need to get together. And the thing is, the community is notoriously bad. They don't do that. I've called up Mashaykh. I've called them up and said, hey, it's a heated time. Let's get together and discuss Islamophobia. Got nothing back. So yes, mashallah, brother, of course. We don't do that. But if I'm a PM, MP, a journalist from The Age, right, a vice chancellor, they will call me back. They will. Trust me, they will. If I'm an academic from the unit, they will call me back and give me everything. But we treat each other quite badly, man. And that's a legacy of racism. It's a legacy.
We never had this conversation around, this MVM and stuff like that just popped up. There was no broader community conversation around, okay, like you said before, what should we do and how should we do it? And
we have, but they don't listen to voices that doesn't align with government management. Like, I don't mean to beat my own drum. Forgive me. I was critical from early days about representative politics as being a counter to Islamophobia. So after September 11, there was the idea that we needed better representation of Muslims to show them that we're not all terrorists, basically. Kind of post-Salam Cafe days and onwards, like just get the right type of Muslim, the professional, Australian, valued, integrated Muslim as a representative figure, and they won't see us all as Osama bin Laden. I'm like, that won't defeat racism, because racism isn't a rational, observational science that just assesses you from right and wrong. It is a strategy and a form of governance that ultimately wants to justify wars overseas and so forth, and then recycle the violence that as a product of violence, so terrorism as a product of colonial violence, not causal but correlative, right? As a result of a bad Islam, a bad reading of the Quran. Critic of that. I was a critic of interfaith dialogue that was presented as a form of contact theory. If we just showed our shared values and spoke about everything, like the idea that Israel doesn't know who Muslims or Christians are. And we know each other, man. Like, we know each other. The problem is that we know each other too well at times, right? So this is the idea that all Australians don't know the true face of Muslims. They don't know Islam, so we've got to give them, like, on a strategic level, some type of dawah. This led to open mosque days and all the rest, and op-eds and blah, blah, blah. I was like, okay, yeah, sure. You want to give dawah and show the good side of it, do it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and spreading Islam. But the idea that will combat racism, yeah, that's unfounded. I was a very early critic of CVE, like very early, right? All the way back to the war on terror when George W. Bush came out in his State of Union address, a critic of the quietism that came out of certain traditionalists of the Sufi readings of Islam, right? And we did anti-CVE work when it wasn't popular, when they called you out, when you got accused of being pro-terrorist, pro-ISIS, right? Now it's a lot easier because of the work of people like me did in the past, right? And not just alone, but we challenged it at the great expense. You did all of these things, okay? And then you also challenged, now we're challenging, let's just skip a few things, MVM, right? Now, all the community remembers from people like me and voices like this is that we made noise. They don't remember. And now they say things, they literally say things that we were saying 5-10 years ago. And my point here is not that, oh, look, mashallah, you got it right. I'm not trying to get a big head or anything. I'm saying this is the product of us not talking with one another. It's not creating contest with one another. It really is, because in any given space, any given organization, the people who have continually tried to do something and repeat it again and again and again, and it hasn't given you the outcome. And there are others in your community that have critiqued and got some things right and so forth. Put them together, we accelerate our learning. I learn from all of them as much as they learn from me. But this silos, this camp, that camp, this camp over here has never helped us. So I honestly think MVM will inevitably go down the same path of every other aspiration that we've ever had in the community. And that's because it's still built on the same pillars of faith in a Western colonial order. Now, we could have saved so many resources, so much time, if we allowed critic to live alongside practical actor. That never happens. And that's why a bloc doesn't exist. That's why it doesn't exist. And it won't. Because we haven't built it. We haven't built it for the last 20 years. We've created little silos. We haven't created a community language that's representative of our contests. We haven't. We've chosen the right voices. They've censored those of us that are not pro-government. They've literally censored us. And I'll give you one example, just a simple, I'll close it. Go when you're in Melbourne to visit the Islamic Melbourne Museum. Just go visit, whatever. Walk around there and ask yourself a simple question. Does anything in this place represent the last 25 years of Muslim life and struggle in Australia? Just ask yourself that question. Does it speak to the turmoil, the pain, the rising up, the chat? Nothing. It's such a sanitized space that's made for the non-Muslim eye. So when you come in, it's like, oh, look, Muslims help to invent coffee and chess, and we have calligraphy on surfboards, because they're not building a community for us. They're building a community for them. So when I go there, I'm like, nothing here represents me. Right? And as long as we have that, all of these things are all, that's what I mean by self-determination. But anyway, I feel like I should stop.
It sort of remind me, I mean, just to tie back to the Sirah, where it's not like the Prophet for sort of forewent his principles, right? Like, kufr was sort of presented to him, and the Prophet always stood strong. Like what you said, similarly, like, what's the point of having those spaces if we have to erase like our Muslim experience, right? Or like what we go through? Like, it doesn't make sense. You're not being authentic. So I think that's really important point as well. And on top of that,
sorry, go.
No, you can go for it.
No, so just to clarify, like, I will leave the religious because I feel uncomfortable saying this. I'm not saying you're wrong or no, but my point was partly about our mourning, our grief, our struggle, our anger is not represented, and typically it's instrumentalized into good citizen tropes, right? And so you can tie all of the projects that I've been speaking into one fundamental project, and that is we still believe that we have to be a good citizen. And once we're good citizens, the reward will come. And that project, no matter how many reiterations of it happens, the same people doing it, look, man, no other corporation would hire the same CEO if he's had 20 years of failure, but we do that. Yeah. So I just think maybe it's time that we sit and reflect on our mourning, our grief, our anger, and listen to one another more, because it's just at the moment, we are not sitting with our wounds. Like, Gaza required a significant amount of self-reflection, sitting down. Like, one of the things that hurt me and hurt others is how helpless we all felt. We needed to sit with that, understand the reasons why we that, what political legacies and colonial obstacles have allowed that to happen. Because at one fundamental level, how could it happen? How can all of these neighboring Arab states, the world, us, how could we allow this to happen? What has occurred for us to be so impotent in our ability to defend our own people? We needed to sit with that. Instead, we rushed, we're going to vote Labour out. Like, we're going to be a better citizen than a good citizen. And if the grief of Gaza was truly understood, I don't think we would rush to translate it into campaign slogans. I think we'd be ashamed to.
What are you doing?
So in regards to Abdullah, I don't know if we talked about at length about the vagueness. Did you want to touch on more about, like, on the website, like the sort of ultimate plan?
We spoke a little bit. We did mention a bit. We touched on it in terms of the vagueness of the actual objectives, goals, what's sought to be. Even the strategy around it, the rollout. For example, from my understanding, it's mostly pamphlet handouts at voting stations eventually on the day of voting, and there was a bunch of data collection through survey monkeys on Facebook. But they don't have the equivalent to polling data like mainstream parties have. And then of course the vagueness around even the strategy and the modeling itself. This is one way of looking at it, like from a scientific point of view of just changing one variable and thinking everything else remains the same, we can get some kind of outcome. And Yassir mentioned around how this is like, more or less describing a 4D chess where so many things are moving around in response to one change. But that I think we covered the vagueness quite a bit. And anyone who looks at the website, and I encourage you to look at the website and really read it and think about it. And then also with the voting cards around certain things like policies around climate change, cost of living, and like we're just regurgitating, like other politicians have, these buzzwords that ultimately really not giving actual like concrete policies around how these are going to change or on how and what it's going to take. For example, if you're independent, you're not really a policy maker, you just sit there as a negotiator between other power brokers. And so it's like there's aspirations but no tangible sort of concrete ways of doing it. And I think that's more of a product of even them after many decades still learning, and a little bit of okay, let's see how it goes. And ultimately, I think when you push the discussion a lot far enough, it just becomes okay. This is all tawakkul, right? That our reliance is upon Allah, and whatever happens, happens. But it only happens in the context of voting, right? So that's the sort of, and ultimately we know that's ultimately true, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the ultimate plan, and we may be little cogs in that plan, and we don't know how that works, but we remain with our principles in Islam and understand our best understanding of the reality ahead of us. So I found that sort of shut down conversation when there's that concession of that everything's up to Allah, but then why is it tied to this system? We can't imagine anything outside of it. But yeah, they're the points that come to my mind. If Yassir, do you want to comment on any of those?
Yeah, look, I do think maybe it's too rushed, whatever, but community consultation would have been nice. I don't know who set this agenda. Like it's an imposition. It sounds like when they put housing prices and all that. Honestly, I felt like they just Googled or ChatGPT current issues that might be appealing to, that are aligned with Muslim. Like you haven't built a foundation or a political legacy or a political communication or a set of underlying ideological principles to say this is Muslims' politics. You've just assumed it. And that would be an inspiration without any truth telling or truth gathering. Has its limits, but I just feel like it's sloganeering. And so without who was invited, who gets to speak, who's expanding the agenda. There's this doctor who I think he's in Islamic studies or business or Islamic business, something is always authorizing them. Who is he? Like why is he like, when did we concede this? When was this allowed? Which is fine, but to gain legitimacy as a movement, grassroots or otherwise, it would really help to do better consultation. There was a meeting at Broadmeadows here, and they didn't really allow for Q&A. Okay, it's now like an imposition, and in order, therefore, to mobilize Muslims, this part, subhanAllah, don't shame us, man. Like one of the ads said, "Don't be complicit in genocide." Don't say things like that, man. Don't. That's not fair. That's not fair. Don't talk like that to Muslims, because there's limitations to what we can do, and these limitations are real. Don't guilt us, man. Like, we already feel terrible, okay? And this pep talk, and then mainstreaming it so they sound like every other, like as a imperially accredited way of sounding like politics. We're going to take care of housing, Who told you that was our concern? Who? It's like Islamophobia counter groups or anti-Islamophobia groups. They haven't told us They haven't consulted with us with what we need. They all assume that we're after belonging and safety. I didn't ask for belonging or safety. None of my circles do. We ask for justice. We ask for justice for Muslims overseas. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm very, very, very safe here. I don't know what they're on about. I'm not asking to not be scared when I go out. I'm asking for my anger to be represented against an unjust system. The amount of times that they talk to you, assuming that they got you, and then in doing you, socially construct an image of you while pretending they're upset that there are stereotypes of Muslims. They rely on a stereotype of the Muslim, uneducated, backward, in need, desperate for belonging, wants to participate in all of the rest. You don't know that's true. None of my circles speak like that. SubhanAllah, none. Right? So if they do want to be representative of Muslims, guess what? Speak to Muslims, not just the ones that you hire to be your volunteers. Speak to us. Speak to your opponents, right? Speak to those who you're in ideological contest with. Go around, create forums, community roundtables. And they haven't done any of that. They've just said, this is what you need, this is what you want, and vote the way we tell you to vote. Okay? Such a critic, bro. Haven't offered any solutions.
So salty and angry.
Cynical.
You need to be in a CBA program.
With old age, by the way.
You need therapy.
Yeah, I try, bro. I try to give myself therapy in the morning.
I think we're done, bro.
Was there anything else you feel, Yassir, we didn't cover?
No, I'm all right. I mean, look, I want to reiterate that I don't think I'm not character profiling anybody. I don't think intent here is my argument, because I've often been accused in the past of making accusations, and I've spoken to a lot of them behind the scenes, and I've tried to do my due diligence of not just being a critic out in the open. And ultimately, I will close on this. Let's say I'm a critic. Everything that we consume, and whether it's our phones or our electric toothbrushes or our car, go through rounds of research and testing. And if I am to be a critic, then I think critics are of benefit. Let's not demonize critics. Critics can help test something. We can break it apart so you can put it back together better. So inshallah, they reach out, and it's a first step. But I do think there needs to be some pushback against the shaming of Muslims. But if I've said anything wrong, may Allah forgive me, and Ramadan Mubarak.
And this is I want to, for me as well, also not intended against any single person. I think this episode is more as an absence of any other wider conversation. And I think, as far as I know, this is probably the first of its kind on this. It's been very polarized in one direction, and so opening up a conversation around this, however late, on a wider level, I think is what should be welcomed. It shouldn't be taken in a really attacking sort of seen in a really negative light. I think it's clearly intellectually stimulating, as well as a lot of practical things to think about and reconstruct, inshallah. So again, yes, I also apologize in advance if I have misspoke or misunderstood. You know where to find me. I'm not in my garage. I'm in my living room today, but you can find me in my garage sometimes.
So just to touch on your point, Abdullah, like, I guess the objective always in the cave is to welcome kind of free discussion. And on top of that, like, we're always welcome to, have anyone from MVM to come on and discuss it with us. Like, if we got some points wrong, like, I want them to kind of talk about it, right? Like, we're the ones, like, we've got friends that got kicked out of MVM group chats, right? We've had friends that don't get allowed to answer questions, right? Like, I won't mention his name, but, like, we're the ones that are, like, trying to make noise, right? But then we're getting, like, ostracized from those groups, right? Like, they're not inviting the conversation. That's our kind of the point that we're trying to make here, and this is why essentially we've sort of done this podcast, right? So for us, like, we're just like, okay, like, let's have that conversation. So we want to invite that conversation. So it's not always, if someone that's a vehemently MVM, supporter, it's not about, just being, critical. Obviously, we want to have the discussion. That's why we're having this podcast in the first place as well, to invite that kind of conversation.
So if you have any spare T-shirts, I think Yassir wants one. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'll use plain door soccer for the lols.
Even beyond. Okay. Okay, let's call it. Let's call it, man. Inshallah.
All right. So yeah, appreciate your time, Yassir Abdullah, coming on the show.
Thank you, Bruce. Appreciate it.
So inshallah, we'll have probably another one regarding another topic. We'll keep that tight-lipped for the time being. So thank you, listeners, for tuning to this podcast. If you want to support us, give us a subscription on or subscribe to us on YouTube, Boys in the Cave podcast. And we're on Apple, iTunes, Spotify, etc. So share around with your friends and family, inshallah. So from our special guest, Dr. Yassir Morsi, and our co-host, Abdullah Hamimi, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing off. Assalamu alaikum.